Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be between the rock and a hard place as we come to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 begins a series of stories. There's six of them. We start with the dream of the image of four kingdoms. We're going to see in chapter 3 the rescue of Daniel's friends from the fiery furnace. Then there'll be a story of Nebuchadnezzar having another dream, this time which results in his humiliation. Belshazzar has a vision of handwriting on the wall, results in his death. So we have two vision slash dream results in the middle. We have another rescue story. This time it's Daniel from the lion's den. And we come full circle at the end. We're going to go from the dream of the image of the four kingdoms in chapter 2 to night visions of four beasts in chapter 7, which means chapter 2 and chapter 7, to fully understand them, we're going to have to see them together. But we're not going to do that this time. When we come to chapter 7, we'll look at both of them together. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 1. Now, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, now we talk about his second year, he had actually become king right after his father had died. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had led the forces of Babylon against Egypt in the Battle of Carchemish, and later that same year, his father died. But that's not considered his first year. That's considered his ascension year. We would call it year zero. And then the following year would be year one. And then the year after that would be his second year. So this is a few years later. Notice by this time he's already collected the first round of deportees, like Daniel and his three friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They've been taken to Babylon. They've been studying their lessons on how to read and write in Akkadian and the language of the Babylonians. And now we read that Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Verse 2, then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. And so they came in and stood before the king. He has gathered them all together. Verse 3, the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. Notice they're Chaldeans, which is from southern Mesopotamia. Aram is a country that's technically a little bit to the west of Mesopotamia. The land of Aram is what we call Syria today, with its capital in Damascus. And that's not that wasn't a big kingdom, but because it was centrally located, Aramaic was the common language of the day. And so notice the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. And then when we read, O king, live forever, and so on, that's actually written in the Aramaic language. Now, Aramaic and Hebrew are very close. So at first, you might not even immediately notice. Actually, I think you would, because they do use different words. They use the same alphabet. They have certain words that are alike, but they're technically two different languages. And so verse 4 switches halfway through the verse to Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. However, when we go to verse 5 and throughout the rest of the chapter and all the way to the end of chapter 7, it will continue in Aramaic. And that's sort of an interesting observation. And so we've switched to Aramaic. Verse 5, the king replied to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. Now, if you look at the King James Version, it reads, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. Was it firm? Was it gone from me? And you can translate the same phrase, actually it's one word, you can translate it either way. And so which is in view here? I don't know. Is he saying, um, I had the dream, but I can't really put my finger on it? I've actually read that when you dream and you first wake up from a dream, if you wake up suddenly, you might remember it a bit, but very shortly thereafter, unless you either talk about it or in some way sort of relive it in your memory, you actually develop, and this happens every night, you develop on the spot amnesia. That's actually what takes place, and you quickly forget your dreams unless you repeat them or go over them right there at that time. Now, did that happen with the king, or um, is he saying, "Look, I did repeat it in my mind. I do know what it said, but I'm not going to tell you because you'll just make up something." So, which is in view here? Um, if you do not make known to me the dream, and that's what he's going to continue, he's going to say, "Look, I want you to tell me what the dream is. And if you don't make known to me what the dream is, then not only will you die, it's going to be a very unpleasant death. I mean, there's all sorts of tortures involved and cutting off body parts, and it's going to be a miserable death. And at the end of it, you'll die. But on the other hand, if you do make known to me the dream and the ideas along with the interpretation, then I'm going to give you honor and riches and all sorts of good things. So what's it going to be? Well, they answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we'll declare the interpretation." I think at this time they're ready to make up an interpretation, but they need to have the dream. Verse 8, the king replied, "I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me," and there's exactly the same phrasing, "the command from me is firm." What's in view there? What is he saying? Verse 9, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. I've made two decrees. Either you're going to be killed with a nasty death, or you're going to live and have all sorts of blessings and riches. But if you don't make known to me, it's option one. For there is only one decree for you, for you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. He sort of has caught them at what their modus operandi is. That is their regular way of doing things. They would make things up, and they would. It wasn't real. And let me just say, when people indulge in telling the future and in making prophecies, very often the case is that it's not real. They speak in generalities or they put it off, Um, and I've actually had some friends that made predictions. And this is going to take place, maybe about a political sort of thing or about something else. And then it didn't happen. And I've called them on it. And I've actually had some friends say, "You're not being a very good friend. You should call me up on it." But you were making a prediction. And you were saying this is going to happen. You didn't say, "Maybe this will happen." That's different. We can all, make a good guess. But you were saying, "This is going to happen." And it didn't happen. Therefore, tell me the dream, Nebuchadnezzar says, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation. So that's the test. You tell me the dream, and I'll know that you really do have power to interpret the dream. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There's not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean." We've had great kings in the past, but none have asked such and they're not saying it's an unreasonable request, but that's the hint. They don't want to contradict the king. After all, he is a great king. Verse 11, moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. Only something supernatural could give such an answer to the king. And so the order is given to kill all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel and his three friends are some of the wise men. And when this news comes to them, he asks for an extension. And then he goes and he prays with his three friends. In verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. This isn't the only time we're going to read of night visions. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And he's already prayed, but now what we're given is not the prayer where he's asking God, but this is the prayer where he is praising God. And he blessed the God of heaven. Verse 20, Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings." And we're going to read in this chapter about kings being removed and kings being established. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. Notice this is given in the form of a poem or a song. Continues verse 22, "It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." Now notice he speaks collectively of he and his friends, even though it's Daniel that's going to do the actual interpretation. And we read back in at the end of chapter 1 that it was Daniel who was given this gift of being able to interpret dreams. Verse 26, the king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, and probably used his Babylonian name instead of his old Hebrew name, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king." Nobody in nature is able to answer the king's request. Only a supernatural event. And Daniel's saying, "I'm not supernatural, but I have a supernatural God." Verse 28, "However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days." So not only are we going to read about what's going to take place in Nebuchadnezzar's day, but most of the events will be events that are going to be prophesied to Nebuchadnezzar about, notice what he calls latter days. Now, latter days, you say, well, latter days must be today. Well, latter days from when Daniel is living. Daniel's going to refer to latter days in a way that's a little bit different than what we might refer to such a term. And so he goes on, "This was your dream and the vision in your mind while on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turned to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries, that's God, has made known to you what will take place." And so the dream of the future had been given to Nebuchadnezzar, but it had been given in such a way that he wouldn't get it on his own. He wouldn't understand it on his own. He needs an interpreter. He needs Daniel. He needs God's servant. Verse 30, "But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than any other living man." Daniel's quick to say, it's not about me. It's not that, I'm super smart, I'm super intelligent, I'm supernatural, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. It has been revealed to me, not because I'm so great, because God's so great. Verse 31, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue." Now, the statue, or we could have translated this an image, and it's the same word. It's not always used of idols, but it can be used of idols and is used that way earlier in the Old Testament. So the king was looking at an image, can we call it an idol? That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. And he goes on to describe the elements of the statue, working from the top and working its way down. He begins with a head, and it has a head of gold. Next, there are the breasts, the chest, and the arms, and they are of silver. Moving on down, There is the belly and the thighs. They are of bronze. We're living at this point in history in the Bronze Age. Actually, by this time we're in the Iron Age. The Bronze Age had come earlier. The crossover was 1200 BC from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Next, you have the legs of iron, and it's interesting that first comes bronze, then the legs of iron, and finally the feet, which are going to be described as almost connected. Well, they're obviously connected to the legs, but it's also iron, but now it's iron mixed with clay. Verse 34, he continues after having seen this image, you continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. So here comes a stone. Did it roll? Did it fall? How did it come? I don't want to say, but it comes and it strikes the statue on its feet and clay and crush them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed. You see, it begins with the feet, but it doesn't stop there. It crushes the entire idol. It crushes the entire statue all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor. Now, a threshing floor is where you would take your grain and you would ground it up, and then you'd throw it up into the air, and the grain would fall down. But the outer kernels that had broken off from the grain, they're very light, and so you're in a windy place when you're doing this, and it would just be caught by the wind and blown away. And notice that the entire statue is likened to the chaff, likened to the dried up husks that take place in the summer. In summer's the dry place in Israel. And the wind carried them away so that there was not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue, it stays. Notice it became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So it's not a stone that rolls up, does the striking, and then is gone, but rather it stays to become not just a stone, but a great mountain, great enough to fill the entire earth. Now, he begins to explain. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom God, the God of heaven, has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar was at this point in history the king of the superpower of the entire world. Now, that hadn't always been the case with Babylon. Babylon, throughout most of its history, had been sort of a second-rate city, not a kingdom, just a tiny, well, not a tiny city. It was still a good-sized city. But as cities go, it was never had been, at least not since not since recent times. But if you go back to its early history, you'd had Babel. Remember the Tower of Babel? It's the same name. But since that time, it has continued to be a second-rate city until Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, and now Nebuchadnezzar have come along, and now it has become this great city with Nebuchadnezzar himself ruling over the city and effectively ruling over the world. And so Babylon, now you say, well, that doesn't look like the whole world. Remember, this is the known world in their day. The area of Mesopotamia, what we call the Fertile Crescent, going all the way to Egypt. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar is going to extend even further into Egypt, but he's already taken in. It's not. I'm not saying it's part of Babylon, but these are areas that are subservient to him. So this Babylonian Empire, stretching through Mesopotamia and down through the Levant and all the way to the borders of Egypt and into Egypt. Next, he says, after you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you. And sure enough, we know from history that the kingdom of Babylon will not last much longer after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. And you'll have a sort of a twofold kingdom. The Medes and the Persians, the Medes had been Babylon's ally when they brought down the city of Nineveh. The Persians, even though they'd been there a long time, had never amounted to much with regard to rulers. They had kings, but they were sort of left to themselves in the highlands of what they called Persia back then, what we called the Iranian Plateau, modern day Iran. That's actually what we call Persia. Um, and the Medes and the Persians, though, would combine, and this combination would march all the way to fight against King Croesus in the city of Sardis, and then would come back against Babylon and would take Babylon without a fight under Cyrus, the king of the Medes and the Persians. Um, and he would march all the way to India. Actually, that's where he would die. But when he died, his kingdom would continue for 200 years. The Persians would rule. He would invade Egypt. He would conquer Egypt. Egypt would actually become sort of a subset of Persia under the Persians. And he would even go so far as to try to invade Greece. Darius the Great conducted an invasion. 10 years later, his son Xerxes conducted an invasion. They didn't really end up capturing it. At the end, they pulled back and they just um, thought it better just to pay the Greeks to fight among themselves. And the Greeks did that very nicely. Um, but virtually the whole known world was conquered by the Medes and Persians. But notice it's called an inferior kingdom. Then a third kingdom, this time of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. And I would suggest, because just in history, the next thing that came about was Alexander the Great, who in the space of 10 years marched, leaving from beginning Macedonia, conquering that previous Medo-Persian Empire, marching through Mesopotamia, all the way to modern-day Afghanistan, into India, never losing a battle. But then, at the end of his life, and he was only 33 years old when he died, at the end of his life, he died, leaving no heir. He did have a child that was born right after his death, but that child did not pick up his kingdom, and instead his kingdom broke up into a number of different pieces. Eventually, and at first there were about 7 different of his generals that divided it up, and a few of those got weeded out, brought it down to about 5 and then 4. But that eventually broke up so that there were some 10 kingdoms. So notice we've had the head, that's Babylon, the breasts, I think it refers to the Persians. The belly and thighs, Alexander and his Macedonian kingdom. But next we have this fourth kingdom, the legs and the feet. And it's here that it's not quite so easy. There are differences of opinion, and I have one. I'm going to share it. We're actually going to look at the possible interpretations. Who are the legs and feet, and what do they represent? Well, verse 40 says, and then there will be a fourth kingdom. Notice it's not a fourth and a fifth. It's not the legs and then the feet. There will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. Notice the breaking in pieces. It's not saying it's building up. It's actually pulling apart and breaking apart what had been there earlier. Verse 41, in that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom. This isn't another kingdom. This is the kingdom he's just been describing. So there's a kingdom of iron, and yet there's a division there. It will be a divided kingdom, but it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. And so we're looking for a kingdom, but not one kingdom, a divided kingdom, a kingdom with maybe multiple divisions. But a division to be divided, you have to have at least 2. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong, and part of it will be brittle. So, yes, it's a divided kingdom, but it's also uneven in its division. It's divided, but part is stronger than the other part. Now, who is this fourth kingdom? One theory, and I think this is very likely the correct one, I'm sort of showing my hand, is that this is the Seleucid kingdom. You say, what's a Seleucid kingdom? When Alexander died, his generals took his kingdom and broke it up in pieces, and then eventually went to fighting among themselves. And the two big winners, remember I said it's going to be divided, the two big winners were the general who took over Egypt. His name was Ptolemy, and one of his subgenerals by the name of Seleucus, who long term ended up with almost everything else, with Anatolia and Mesopotamia and lands going all the way to the east, although eventually those were sort of given up too as attention came to the conflict between Seleucus and Egypt. And so we're talking about that which breaks up the empire of Alexander. This works. A rule which encompasses the former kingdom. You see, Alexander's rule largely had taken over from the Persians, but now included Macedonia and Greece as parts that Alexander had taken early on, but then encompassed that, which is what the prophecy states. It has to encompass the former kingdom. Thirdly, it was a divided kingdom, and it was, especially between Seleucus and Ptolemy. They actually started out being friends. At one point, they even, not them, but their grandchildren, actually engaged in a marital alliance where there was a marriage that took place. The son of one married the daughter of the other. But that didn't last, and the kingdom went divided. And this is going to be very significant to the nation of Judah, the Jewish people, because they live in between these two kingdoms, and it's going to influence and have an impact on how they live. So a divided kingdom. Eventually, there were 10 kingdoms that came out from this, of which the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were the largest ones, but there were others as well. Pontus and Cappadocia, a number of other kingdoms, Bactria in the east. And when I know this is getting ahead of ourselves, but when we come to Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11, it will be evident that what is being described is the king just to the north of Israel and the king just south of Israel, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And that's going to be the focus of those parallel prophecies when we get to Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11. But we're not going to go there at this time. Now, the other view sees this fourth kingdom as Rome. And I can see that as an application. You see, there's sometimes a prophecy that's given that has an immediate application. Well, it's not too immediate because the Seleucids, they come a few hundred years after Daniel. But then after them, you eventually have Rome on the scene. And maybe that is also almost like a shadow of the earlier prophecy. The problem is their rule doesn't extend east of Mesopotamia. So it's to be those former kingdoms that consist of part of it, and yet that doesn't work because Rome never made it. They barely made it to Mesopotamia, and they certainly didn't expand their rule to the east of that. Was Rome divided? Well, not in the period we usually talk about. Many hundreds of years later, you have Constantine dividing it. So, but Rome was not a divided empire prior to that. Where do you get the 10 kingdoms from? And people have tried and tried and tried. It doesn't really work for the 10 kingdoms. Now, what does work is we're going to see a prophecy of Messiah coming. He's not going to be called that, but I think it is Messiah, who comes in the days of this kingdom. And there, I think that does work. But when you see Messiah coming in the book of Daniel, sometimes it can refer to an earlier anointed one, and sometimes it refers to the ultimate anointed one. Of course, the ultimate anointed one is Jesus. But we're going to see later on in Daniel that there will be, in a sense, almost like a type of Messiah, a priest, and priests are always anointed, who is on the scene. So which is it? And my answer is, well, maybe sort of both. But let's continue and see the rest of the prophecy. Verse 44, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. That picture of the stone coming down and crushing is going to be fulfilled when God sets up a kingdom that is not to be destroyed. What kingdom does God set up? Well, in the days of the Seleucids, you can say, well, there's a sense in which he sets up Israel. He sets up Judah. But is that kingdom ultimately destroyed? Was the kingdom of Israel, was the kingdom of Judah destroyed? They actually went through a destruction in 70 AD. So would that fit? Except that you remember that Jesus had come and had called out a remnant of that kingdom with which he was building a much greater kingdom, a kingdom made up of Jews and Gentiles, a kingdom which will not be left for another people. In other words, there's not another kingdom that comes after that, but will eventually put an end to all the kingdoms. Really? Yes. What did Jesus say to his disciples? Go and make disciples of all the nations. This kingdom is going to overcome all those other kingdoms, and it will last. It will endure forever. What did Jesus say? And lo, I am with you always, Matthew chapter 28 and verse 20. Verse 45, inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, not just one of them, but all of them, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future, so the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. Now, verse 46, King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face. Notice he actually takes these words, which doesn't say you're going to have a fall, but he says, eventually all these kingdoms, your own kingdom too, are going to fall. King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel and gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. It sounds very much like King Nebuchadnezzar was convinced of the truthfulness of the prophecy. Verse 47, the king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings. It reminds me of when you read about something very much like that in the book of Revelation. Lord of lords and King of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. Verse 48, and the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. That makes me wonder, did this mean that Babylonians, and we'll come back to this maybe in a future class, but did Babylonians perhaps keep a record of some of Daniel's prophecies? I like to think that perhaps they did. Verse 49, and Daniel made request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon, and we're going to see more about that in the next chapter, while Daniel was at the king's court. Now, some closing thoughts. First of all, I want you to notice that God is God of God, God of gods, Lord of kings, Lord of lords. He is sovereign over kings and kingdoms, and he raises them up, and he's able to bring them down. Not just kings back then, not just nations back then, but nations today as well. God is still sovereign. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Notice also how the image is a picture of idolatry. Now, even in the New Testament, we are warned, Christians are warned to flee idolatry. 1 John, the first epistle of John, actually ends, that's the very last verse in 1 John 5:21, where he says, little children, flee idolatry, which means that Christians, even today, can be guilty of engaging in idolatry. You say, well, I've never bowed down to an image or an idol or anything like that. No, but we do it in other ways. Perhaps it is by holding up something that we see, uh, that we give greater attention to and greater love and greater adoration than we do to God. And this also means that kingdoms and kings, and I would suggest even modern politics, can be a form of idolatry. When we look to anything as a savior beyond the savior that God himself sent, and I'm not talking about this king or that president or this elected official over here, when we look for salvation from things like that, we have just bowed down to an idol. We worship a better king, a king that commands our worship, that commands our trust, our faith, and our obedience. I want you to notice also that our king is pictured as a stone cut without hands. And this points to the fact of one who is from past eternity. He wasn't brought about by an act of human will. He was brought about by God. And on the one hand, he existed from all eternity, but humanly speaking, he was born not just between a man and woman, born of a virgin, cut without hands, we would say. He is the stone, which in the words of Psalm 118, he is the stone which the builders rejected. And of course, to those who believe, he's become our solid foundation. But to those who rejected, he has become a stone of stumbling, a stone that crushes, a stone that brings to an end all those things that other people worship. And finally, I think it's striking, no pun intended, that his victory is announced by a stone that has been rolled away. He died and rose again from the dead, as the empty tomb announces, by that stone which was removed. And he becomes the stone that crushes all idols, that will eventually rule the nations with a rod of iron, and will rule your heart too, so that one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord.